All right. So one day, the Apostle Paul wrote this letter that we have misunderstood for like 2,000 years. I mean, it's not that we've misunderstood it. It's just that we misunderstand it. So we call it the book of Romans. It's in the New Testament. And whenever, like, today, 2,000 years after the fact, we think of the book of Romans as this, like, complicated theological treatise. Like, when you go to Bible college, you go to seminary, Romans is always one of the toughest classes you can take. It's long, it's in depth, it's really complicated, we think. And to a degree, all that stuff is true, but also it's a letter. It's all it is. It's a letter. And it's not, Paul didn't write this as a complicated book of theology. He didn't dream that I would be talking about it 2,000 years from now, because Paul didn't dream there'd be a 2,000 years from now. I mean, just the whole thing. So Paul wrote this letter to a church, a group of Christians who had a specific, personality. And the book of Romans is written to the church in Rome, and Rome was the biggest city in the world. It was the core of the empire. It was the heart of the empire. It was a terrible place to live if you were a Christian because, Romans didn't, there's a lot of religions in Rome, but Christianity was seen as this cult that everybody disliked. And it was also really difficult because it was like this melting pot. And we're used to, as Americans, we're used to diversity. Like, we're used to people who don't look like us, who don't think like us, who don't believe like us, who don't, worship like us. Like, we're used to all of that. But in the ancient world, that didn't happen quite as often. And for the most part, people kind of stuck to their own, really. And so anywhere you could get this diversity, it was difficult. So Rome was a really hard place to live. It was very diverse. And so if you read the book of Romans in the future, just remember the book of Romans is all about equality and unity. Equality and unity. It's all about how we are all in the same boat. We're all, going in the same direction. Jews, Gentiles, men, women, slave free, whatever it is. We are all moving in the same direction, and that we should all be united as people who, want to do right and want to follow Jesus. So as part and parcel of the conversation, the Apostle Paul ends up talking a lot about sin. Because as it turns out, sin is one of the great unifiers of human beings. It's a great unifier in two ways. The first way that it's a great unifier is, well, we all sin. And anyone who says they're not sinning, or anybody who says they don't sin, or anybody who says they're not tempted to sin, or anybody who says they don't struggle with sin, is a liar. Like, that, everybody sins, everybody struggles, everybody has difficulties. We all sin. And so because of that, that's one thing that no matter what else we believe, where else we're from, how else we look like, how else we worship, what, traditions we follow, we are all people who do the wrong thing purposely. We all struggle with wanting to do the right thing, and that's sin. And so we always hurt ourselves, and we always hurt other people. And so it's a great unifier. If nothing else, everybody is sinful. Everybody does stupid stuff. Everybody, hurts each other. Everybody hurts themselves, and here we are. But that, of course, is not the gospel, because, man, what a terrible piece of news that is. If that was all that Christianity was everybody's terrible. Good day to you. Have fun. If that's all Christianity was, that's a lot of people, that is all Christianity is. But if that's all Christianity is, it's not good news. The good news is what unifies all of us as well. And Paul goes into depth about how God reacts to sin the same way for all of us. Right? There are not like 5 answers from God to sin. There's not 2 answers from God to sin. There is one answer. God, whenever and wherever there is sin, God shows mercy and love and forgiveness. That is who God is. That is what God does. And it does not matter who we are, and it does not matter how we sin, and it does not matter what goes on. The natural order of things is people sin and God forgives, and people sin and God shows mercy, and people sin and God shows compassion. That's it. The great unifier of all of us is that we all sin and that God shows us all mercy. So if you're following along in your head, that's Romans chapter 5. That is, like, I just in a paragraph or whatever, 2 minutes in a sermon, that is Romans chapter 5. That is it, right? We all sin, but God shows mercy to all of us. The great unifying force for all of us, which is not just in Romans 5, but it's all throughout the first big chunk of Romans. So then we get to the part that all of this is leading to. When Paul gets a little bit sacrilegious, when Paul gets a little even blasphemous, and asks a question that, frankly, I don't know that most of us would have thought to ask, but he asks anyway, and he sees as really, really important. This is what we read in the book of Romans, chapter 6. This is what Paul says. He says, well then, should we keep on sinning so that God can show us more and more of his wonderful grace? Of course not. Since we have died to sin, how can we continue to live in it? Or have you forgotten that when we were joined with Christ Jesus in baptism, we joined him in his death? For we died and were buried with Christ by baptism. And just as Christ was raised from the dead by the glorious power of the Father, now we also may live new lives. Since we have been united with him in his death, we also will be raised to life as he was. And we know that our old sinful selves were crucified with Christ, so that sin might lose its power in our lives. We are no longer slaves to sin. So Paul explains this, but it's all predicated on what I think is kind of a sacrilegious question. Paul says, okay, fine. So God is going to forgive us. God is going to show mercy. Every time we sin, God shows mercy, right? So Paul just says, well, then what are we going to do? Just sin all the time? So that it gives God an opportunity to show his mercy? Is that what we're going to do? We're just going to just do whatever. We're just going to give up on all the stuff. We're just, not going to worry about being Christian at all because God's just going to cover it anyway, right? Is that what we're going to do? And he says, of course not. But it's funny what his answer is. What his reasoning is, right? Like, he doesn't say, well, that's not how God's grace works. Actually, he just explained that is how God's grace works, so he doesn't say that. So he doesn't say, well, God, when I was a kid, I remember being told, God will forgive you if you repent of a sin, but, if you keep repenting of the same sin, at one point he's going to stop forgiving you. And I remember being taught that by people who had absolutely no idea what they were talking about, but for some reason we're teaching Sunday school to children. Like, this is what we do. Like, Paul has laid it out. We sin, God shows forgiveness, right? Okay, got it. So he doesn't say that. Like, he doesn't say, well, that's not how God works, because he just explained that's how God works. And he also doesn't do what preachers today often say, which is kind of focus on the nature of sin. Like, you might say, I've done it before, where it's like, well, you don't want to sin because sin hurts and there's consequences to sin. And yeah, we have forgiveness, but, you can't, the consequences still happen and you still hurt other people and you still hurt yourself. And Paul doesn't do any of that either. I mean, I think all that's right, but that's not Paul's strategy. Interestingly enough, as he asks this question, which I think is bordering, being unfaithful here, is, well, should we just do this? He actually points to baptism, which is a little weird when you think about it, but not weird when you think about it further. Like, when you first think, you don't think, oh, baptism. But when you think what baptism means, it really starts to make sense. You see, as we have talked about in this series, baptism is us uniting ourselves to Christ. And what Paul is saying right here is that at the end of the day, when we were baptized, something fundamentally changed with us. Fundamentally, we were slaves to sin, and now we aren't anymore. Fundamentally, we died to our old selves, and we were given a new life. Just as Christ is risen from the dead, now we have a new life. What Paul says is, don't you know about your baptism? In other words, remember your baptism. His answer is not about sin. His answer is not about God. His answer instead is, remember what happened when you were baptized. Remember what you committed to when you were baptized. Fundamentally, you became a different person. You became a person who does not look at, sin as something you should do and just not worry about. Fundamentally, you became a person who is a follower of Christ, united with Christ in all things, wanting to bring goodness into the world, wanting to share the gospel, wanting to be people of love and grace and compassion yourselves. Okay. Everything I just said is Christianity 101. Like, that is ground floor, first day through the doors, super simple Christianity, okay? Here's why I bring it up. If you think about what Paul just said, if you think about what we just read, Paul is making a giant assumption about life. That question that I think is bordering on not being a question you should even be asking is a giant assumption. And that assumption is this: there are things in life that will make us want to quit. That's what Paul is assuming. That's what Paul is taking for granted. He does not ask this question if that is not true. He is asking this question because Paul assumes that even for you and me as Christians, as believers, as followers of Christ, that there are things in our lives that will make us want to throw up our hands and say, no more. Enough. I am out. Paul assumes by asking the question is predicated on the idea that you and I might live a life following Jesus and one day get to a point where we say, it's not worth it anymore. I want to be done. There's no point in this. God's going to show mercy anyway, so just let God show mercy. And for me, this whole following Jesus, this not sinning thing, that to Christ, when he says, remember your baptism, he's assuming that for you and I, we might forget our baptisms. And actually, he's assuming that often we do forget our baptisms. The assumption from Paul is that sometimes we want to quit. And there are rational, reasonable situations in which we would want to quit. And now that I've said that out loud, we should talk about an old lady named Rita. She's not really old in the story that we're going to tell, but she lived a long time ago. She lived in the 14th century. She lived so it was like 1380s, like very late in the 1300s, 14th century, but late 1300s if we're trying to follow along. And she lived, what is that, 700 years ago? And Rita lived in a place in Italy called Cascia. And Rita had a childhood that was basically normal. She was raised as nobility. Her parents were noble. She was raised with money and with comfort, and she was raised with love, and she was raised in just a very nice family. And she was raised by parents who introduced her to Christ very early on. And she fell absolutely head over heels in love with the church and with God and with serving Christ and serving other people. And so Rita, from a very young age, knew exactly what she wanted to do with her life. She knew exactly how she wanted to spend all of her time. She wanted to serve the church to the to the best of her ability in the biggest capacity she could. And for her, in late 14th century Italy, that meant being a nun. And as it turns out, as luck would have it, right in the town that she lived in, there was actually a monastery, St. Mary Magdalene Monastery. And she wanted to go there. And she made it very clear from a very young age. She kind of, how kids are, like she badgered her parents, like, hey, I want to go to live in that monastery. I want to go live in that monastery. I want to be a nun. I want to serve the church. I just want to do that. Like, I want to live in that monastery. Like, I don't want to live in another monastery. I want to live at that monastery. And that's what she did. She made it very clear that that's what she wanted to do. And when she became 12, which, as it turns out, is marrying age in the 1300s, her parents decided that, we don't really care what you think. I mean, she was pretty. She had suitors. And suitors meant money. And meant prestige. And meant being part of families. And meant all the wonderful things that we have in the world. And one of those suitors was a man by the name of Paolo Mancini. Paolo Mancini showed up. And he was everything a family who was trying to marry their daughter off in the 14th century would want. He was handsome. He was rich. He was from a good family. I mean, like not just like a good family, but he was from like a wealthy family, a respected family. He was from a family that everybody knew about, that everybody kind of looked up to. Everybody, they just knew the Mancinis. Oh, the Mancinis. Everybody knew that. And so Paolo Mancini shows up, and Rita, I mean, she's beautiful, and she's like everything he wants in a wife, and he's everything that her parents want in a husband. And so she doesn't get to go to the monastery. She ends up married off to Paolo Mancini. So Rita is now Mrs. Mancini. And that is really when the story starts to get a little bit dark. Because, see, as it turns out, there's different kinds of respect. And there's different kinds of admiration. There's admiration and respect because of like a family or a person because they're good people. That's one kind of admiration and respect. There's also admiration and respect of a family or people because they'll break your leg if you don't. And that was the kind of respect that the Mancinis had. From now on, the easiest way to think about it is it's just an episode of The Sopranos. That's all it is. The Mancinis were a mob family, essentially. Like, they didn't call it that, but they were a crime family. They were a family that made a lot of money off of criminal activities. They were violent. They were well known. Turns out everybody knew this because, well, you didn't want your legs broken, and so the Mancinis were not good people at all. And Paolo Mancini was leading the parade at not being a good person. He was violent. He was bloodthirsty. Like, he enjoyed hurting people, and that included Rita, who he hurt like every day. He hit her, he degraded her, he demeaned her, he just basically tortured her. He beat her for the entirety. They were married 18 years, and there was not a day that went by that he did not beat her for 18 years. Maybe worse than that, though, he wasn't faithful, even a little bit. Like, she gave him 2 sons, and that was cool for him, I guess. But, man, he grew bored of Rita in like 15 minutes and just went to be with anyone and everyone else. And of course, this is the man that everybody's afraid of, so there aren't a lot of women turning him down. This is Rita's life now. She's with a man who abuses her physically, who abuses her spiritually, and violates her, and by violating their marriage. And it's really just hell. So she commits herself to raising her sons the best she can. Right? So she's got these 2 sons, and she says, okay, I'm going to raise them in the church, and, their role, they are next in line to lead the family here. I want to make sure that doesn't happen. And so she teaches them from a really young age, hey, you should follow Jesus, you should get involved in the church, don't be like your dad. And of course, little kids want to be like their dad, like they want to follow their dad. And so it's this constant struggle, and it's this difficulty. And so she realizes, if I'm going to save my sons, I've got to save my husband too. So she prays for her husband, she's patient, she does everything he asks, she does everything she can to try to show him love and kindness and tenderness and compassion, even though she's getting absolutely the opposite back. And for 18 years, her life is hell. Until one day, a miracle. Her husband kind of breaks. He snaps. And Paolo realizes that the only thing in his life that's ever been good has been this wife of his that he's mistreated so badly. And so he apologized. And he repented. And he committed from that day forward to being the best husband he possibly could be. And then another crime family sensed weakness in the Mancinis and murdered him. See, that's what we like to call a plot twist. Plot twist. Paolo Mancini is dead now because he repented and tried to do the right thing. Don't join the mob, kids, is an alternate lesson to this sermon. So now you got these sons. And the sons, it's entirely possible that, in fact, it's probable that had Paolo lived, that the sons would have been fine. But turns out, nope, that they're not fine now, because now their father's been murdered. He's got all these guys are like, hey, you are now leading the family. You need to get revenge. You need to lead the family now. You are now the Mancinis. And so, of course, the sons just jump full force into leading this crime family. And Rita is beside herself, trying to figure out what to do. And so she prays, and she prays, and she prays. God, do something. Do something so that they don't fall into the same sins that Paolo was in. And it's then that her sons got dysentery and died. This is a terrible story. It's a terrible story. Terrible story. It happened. I thought it only happened on the Oregon Trail, but it does happen in Italy in the 1400s. So now Rita, who's beginning to wonder, I've been praying for 18 years, and the first result of my prayer was my husband was murdered. The second result of my prayer is, I don't know, it didn't stop my sons from dying, so I don't. She doesn't know what to do, and she is now a widow. She's now like 30 years old or so, and she's a widow and she's childless, and she doesn't know what to do. And so the only thing she can think to do is go to the monastery, Saint Mary Magdalene Monastery. And she decides, I'm going to go there and I'm going to be a nun for the rest of my life. It's what I always wanted to do anyway. And so she goes to the monastery. And she goes and she says, I want to be a nun. And they say, oh, good. Well, you're not a virgin, so no. This is a terrible story. And she begs, and she says, what can I do? And they said, well, you can't make yourself not a virgin, so basically nothing. And she begs and she pleads, and they say, well, even if you were a virgin, you're a Mancini, so nope, we don't bring mob families in here. It's not what we do. And they turn her away. Again and again, they turn her away. And finally, somebody comes up with what I am positive was just, a test that she was supposed to go and never be able to do and just die trying at. And they said, okay, look, your husband had a lot of enemies, yeah? The Mancinis, your sons had a lot of enemies. Mancini's got a lot of enemies. If you can make peace with all the families that the Mancinis had enemies with, that will prove to us that God wants you to be a nun. They gave her a test. As if she hadn't been through enough, they gave her a test, which is really an impossible task. I've watched a lot of movies with the mob, watched some documentaries with the mob. It doesn't feel like they're big on making peace because a woman cries, or just simply asks them to. And yet, I wouldn't be telling this story if it didn't work. Rita says, okay, good, I have a task to do. It took her about 6 years to do. And she managed to make peace with all of her husband's enemies. And probably grumbling because they never wanted this woman here and they were just trying to find a reason not to have her here. The nuns of the monastery finally welcome her in 3 decades after she wanted to be there in the first place. Don't worry, the story has a happy ending. She ends up running that place for the next 40 years. And she is, I'm talking about her because she is not just Rita of Cascia, she is Saint Rita of Cascia. Now, I'm not Catholic. I'm not Orthodox. I'm not Anglican. I'm not Coptic. All these different, people who have saints. I'm not those people. And so I fully understand that my interpretation of the story is probably going to be something less than they want me to have it be, probably. But I love telling stories of saints. I love the stories of the saints. I just love them. I think they're great, and they give us such a window into things. And this might be my favorite story of a saint because it is the worst story I've told in a long time. It's so bad, guys. That life is there's a part of me I'm pretty sure that all happened and it's historical, but there's such a part of me that's I hope somebody embellished some of that because that's awful. That's a terrible story. It's such a terrible story that Saint Rita is actually the patron saint of impossible causes. Of impossible causes, which is really funny when you think about it. Here's the thing about Saint Rita. Every single person in her life failed her. Just across the board. It started with her parents, who, you tell your parents, I would like to go be a nun. You would think as parents who are Catholic in the late 1300s, you'd be like, yeah, that's great. You have so many other lives that would be horrible. There's a plague going on, guys. Go be a nun, and then there's there's so many places that she could have ended up that was worse than being a nun. And her parents just completely just failed, just did not care. Because frankly, they lived in a society that failed people, because failed at least young girls and women, because I don't know, maybe 12 is too young to marry girls off. I don't know. Call me crazy. But she lived in a society where it's just, well, you're a pretty 12-year-old, better go with that guy. And that's just the world that she lived in. The entire culture fails her. The husband fails her, Paolo. I don't know what else you call 18 years of abuse and infidelity. Her sons fail her. She raises her sons to be anything but their father. And the second the father is gone, they're like, well, better go be our father. Just, again, 15 years. I don't know how old they were, but long enough to where they were raised to be better than that, and they weren't. I think the people who fail the most are the church. I mean, imagine, like, it wasn't her fault she wasn't a virgin, guys. She did not want to get married at 12 to a crime boss. I am positive that's true. I mean, she's not a virgin because somebody else chose that for her. She was a Mancini. Like, they're upset because she's in this crime family. She's part of this crime family because, again, someone chose that for her. I don't think she's like, well, I want to be a nun, but if I'm not a nun, then I think my backup plan B, is I want to run with the mob and be in an episode of The Sopranos for 18 years. Like, and the church is just like, nope, you done made mistakes, you're out. Everyone failed this woman. I'd even say that, at least from the perspective of her, I mean, the perspective of rational people, it could be argued that God failed her. I mean, where is God when she's praying as a little kid, God, let me be a nun? Where's God then? I mean, he's not answering that prayer. You'd think that'd be a prayer God'd be stoked on. Like, God'd be happy to have somebody want to be a nun, but where's God in that? Where's God when her parents are marrying her off to this guy? Where's God when she's being beaten every day? Where's God when her husband's out with other women every night? Where is God when her sons are not listening to her and her husband's getting murdered and her sons are dying of dysentery? Where's God when she's going to the church and the church is saying, nope, I don't want you? I mean, she's a saint. I doubt she'd say it, but I will. This is a woman. Her patronage is so perfect. She's the patron saint of impossible causes because her life was impossible. It's impossible. Which means at least 700 years in the church, faithful believers in Christ, our brothers and sisters in the Catholic Church, have told us that sometimes life is impossible. Sometimes faith is impossible. Sometimes you're not going to win. No matter what. Sorry. You're not winning that one. It's not a real uplifting message, but it's also the truth. I don't think it does us a lot of good to say otherwise, because otherwise it's a lie. There's some battles we don't win. There's some situations that are impossible. And that's why Paul writes what he writes. You see, Paul takes for granted that lives like Rita's happen and are real. Paul takes that for granted. He takes for granted that we would look at our lives, we would look at the gospel, we would look at the world, we would look at who we are, we'd look at who God is, and we'd say, you know what, forget it. It doesn't matter. Who cares if we do the right thing? Who cares if we live in a way that's righteous and holy? And who cares if we put goodness in the world? Who cares if we follow Jesus? It doesn't matter. None of it matters. Paul anticipated that there are reasons, real reasons that look a whole lot like the life of Rita, to say, I quit. There are reasons to quit. Rita becomes a saint in part because, well, the Catholics said she did all these miracles and everything else, but Rita becomes interesting to me because Rita doesn't quit. I mean, I can tell you I would have. She doesn't quit. She sticks it out. She's running that monastery. She's like 40. Like, she gets to that monastery and she's like, all right, we're reorganizing. She doesn't quit. Her sons die. Her husband dies. Her family betrays her. Her faith is, if nothing else, confusing. And she doesn't quit. And I would draw a straight line between what Paul teaches and what I think Rita's life was like. You see, Paul says that when we want to quit, we need to understand that we were baptized. And that means that we made a commitment to follow Jesus. We signed up for this. It's an emotional, spiritual decision, but it is also a practical one. We signed up for this. We said, that's the life I want. And as we made that choice, We are united with Christ, and something fundamentally changes about us. We are no longer slaves to sin. We were dead to our old life. We are born again to a new one. And that means we are people who do not quit. Later on, Paul wrote another letter. This one was to not a church, but an individual. His name was Timothy. Timothy was a preacher in a place that was impossible to preach. I mean, when I say impossible, like it was. I mean, he ends up getting killed because he's preaching there. Like, it's that kind of impossible. Like, his story does not end happily in Ephesus. Ephesus was just a place that was so hard to have a church. It was so hard to be Christian. They were devoutly religious in ways that were just so against Christianity, and they were violent, they were hostile, and it was just a mess. And Timothy is one of Paul's best friends, and Paul tells Timothy, all right, man, that's your church. Go preach there. And Timothy's like, do you have a door number 2? Could I go to, a different church that is not in any way like that one? And Paul says, nope, that's yours. Enjoy. But he writes 2 letters to him. And in one of those letters, he gives us, it's this fascinating statement. And it's just the perfect, I love this passage of Scripture because it's not real flowery, and it's not the type of thing you stitch on a pillow, and it's not, it's practical, it's real. And this is what it says. It's in 2 Timothy chapter 2. It says, this is a trustworthy saying. If we die with him, then we'll also live with him. If we endure hardship, we will reign with him. If we deny him, he will deny us. If we are unfaithful, he remains faithful, for he cannot deny who he is. Man, I love that passage because it defies category. Is that an encouraging passage? I don't know, maybe a little. But it does talk about us dying and suffering. Is that a passage of like conviction? Yeah, I don't know, maybe, but it does talk about how we're going to be unfaithful. And it promises that when we are unfaithful, that, God is faithful to us because we're a part of him, and God can't deny who he is. And if we're part of God, then he can't deny who he is. Okay, so is this super happy and just encouraging? We're back to that? Well, no, because there's a threat in the middle of this. And you could call it, you could say it's not a threat, but like, I've been threatened a lot. And that's a threat. Oh, I don't know that I've been threatened a lot in my life, actually. That sounded like I'm in the mob. I'm not. No, like we're familiar with the concept of a threat, right? That's not like, if we deny him, he will deny us. One of the things that Paul does to sort of defies all of our categories is, Paul he is just so adamant that we participate in our own salvation. We participate in our own faith. We are not passive as Christians. We're not. Even though Christ died for us, even though salvation is a gift of Christ, even all the things that it's all Jesus, we participate in all this. And he says, look, you might die, Timothy, and he was right. Timothy dies for this. You might suffer. Okay, well, okay. But see, there's a line. There's a line. If somebody tells me that they've never questioned their faith, I know I've got somebody who's not telling me the truth. Or maybe somebody who became a Christian 2 days ago. And that questioning is going to come on day 3. We all struggle with faith. We all struggle to believe. We all struggle to do the right thing. We all struggle with where we fit. We all struggle with that. We may go through large periods in our lives where I don't know what I think about God or where I stand with God or what anything. If we are unfaithful, that just makes us human. Period. God's faithfulness is not dependent on ours. God's faithfulness is dependent on God. The part of that scripture that is probably not really a threat, but is just a statement. If we deny Christ, he denies us. Jesus says the same thing in Matthew chapter 10. If we deny Christ, he denies us. You see, there's a line we can cross where we quit. God expects us to struggle. God does not expect us to quit. You see, there's a difference. And it's hard because the life of Rita tells us, the fact that Paul writes what he writes in Romans tells us there are reasons to quit. Like, I hate when people act like there's not reasons to quit. Like, I need to be upfront. Like, I have nearly not been a Christian over the last 5 years. Look around in this country and this world. There are reasons to say I'm out. I'm out. There are reasons. They are good reasons. They are compelling reasons. Like, we should be honest about that. There are reasons to quit on our faith. Because people fail us. Because culture fails us. Because the world is broken and everything's messed up. And so there's reasons to quit. But we were baptized, right? Like, remember, you got baptized, says Paul. You made a commitment. And when you made that commitment, you were united with Christ. And you changed. So it doesn't matter what else is going on in the world. It doesn't matter who else fails you. It doesn't matter how many good reasons there are to quit. You don't deny Jesus. You don't quit. And when you are unfaithful, he's faithful to you because that's who he is. Now, listen, some of you guys may have been having an awesome morning before this sermon, and like this sermon just doesn't do anything for you. Stick it in your back pocket for when you're maybe having a bad day later. I don't know. But see, I think we've been talking in this series for the last, final week of our series called Water and Blood. We've been talking about communion and baptism, and I think it's so powerful to realize that these emblems were born out of pain. You know? Like, communion's built on the night Jesus is betrayed and murdered. It's a bad night. Baptism is born on the premise of us recognizing who we are and realizing I need to die to be given a new life. Think about the imagery there. In 2021, in our extremely sensitive culture, there is no possible way you could create a religion in which the primary symbols are, hey, it's like blood and you're eating a guy. And also, let's put you in the water and it's like you're being buried in the ground. And then raised to life. These are grisly images, guys. These are images born in pain. These are images born in death. But they're images that are also showing us the new life we're given by God. And there are times we want to quit. And when we want to quit, and when we want to just be done with the whole thing, we need to remember our baptisms. We made a commitment. And we meant it. And through that commitment, we are united with Christ. We are his. He is ours. And you cannot deny yourself. And I think that's true for us as much as it's true for God if we simply look at it from the right perspective. Rita had every reason to quit. She's the patron saint of impossible causes. And she didn't. Timothy had every reason to quit. He didn't all the way until he died doing what he did. Paul had every reason to quit, and he died well before Timothy did. We have reasons to quit. And when we're faced with those, we remember our baptisms. We're in our final week of our series called Water and Blood, and our fifth lesson is this. There is always a reason to give up. But baptism reminds us that God is always with us, so we never should. There is always a reason to give up, but baptism reminds us that God is always with us, so we never should. I'm going to sing a song here. We give this invitation each and every week to take God up on this promise. Baptism is always a part of that. If I need to keep talking about baptism, I just spent like 40 minutes talking about it, so you guys know. If you've never been baptized and you want to, let's talk. And if you're already an immersed believer in Christ, you're looking for a perfect church home, this place is not it. But we do serve a perfect God. We want to connect. We want to call. We want to cultivate. We want to meet new people. We want to share the gospel. We want to grow up while we do it. And we want to not quit. There are always reasons to, and we want to make sure that we never do. As we stand,